You don't look like someone with $500,000, so unless you want trouble, I suggest you leave before I call the police." The words sliced through the quiet hum of the bank lobby like a razor. They came from Thomas, the branch manager of First National Bank, his voice flat but loaded with contempt. His eyes, narrowed with suspicion, were fixed on the man standing before him, a calm, well-dressed black man in his late 50s, holding nothing but a driver's license, a corporate debit card, and decades of quiet dignity. Before we go further, where are you watching from today? And if stories like this move, you make you think, or simply stir something inside, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click like so more people hear voices that matter. Now let's get back to what happened on that unforgettable afternoon in Atlanta, because it didn't just end with a threat. It ended with a lesson the entire city would remember. David Coleman had walked into First National Bank at exactly 3:58 in the afternoon, right on schedule. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't causing a scene. He was simply there to complete a high-value transaction, one that had been arranged days in advance. His firm, Coleman Holdings, had just secured a major property deal downtown, and the seller had requested cash, $500,000. It wasn't unusual at his level. What was unusual was the reaction. David approached the counter with quiet confidence and offered his credentials to the teller, a young woman named Jessica, who barely looked up from her screen. The moment she saw the amount, her demeanor shifted. Her voice turned curt. Her fingers stopped typing. She stared at him with that expression he'd seen far too often in his life, an expression that asked a question her lips didn't dare voice. "How could someone like you possibly have this kind of money?" Jessica tapped a button and muttered one moment. Less than a minute later, Thomas emerged from the office. He was a man in his early 40s with slicked back hair, a stiff walk, and the kind of superiority that couldn't be taught, it had to be inherited. He didn't ask David any questions. He didn't verify the account. He didn't even glance at the name on the card. He simply looked at David and said, "We've had a lot of fraud lately. You'll need to come back with a banker." David raised an eyebrow. "I scheduled this withdrawal on Monday. Your team confirmed everything by phone." Thomas crossed his arms. "Doesn't matter. We're not handing over that kind of cash without real proof of who you are. This card could belong to anyone." David kept his voice level. "You have my ID, you have my card, you have my face, and you have a record of my appointment?" Jessica laughed quietly, as if amused by the whole scene. "You people always think you can bluff your way through," she said under her breath, but not low enough to avoid being heard. David didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly replied, "I'd like you to check the executive accounts file. Search for Coleman Holdings." Thomas sneered. "Mr. Coleman, if that's even your real name, we don't hand out $500,000 to just anyone who walks in wearing a suit. We have policies." The moment hung heavy in the air. A few customers nearby had turned to watch. Among them was Sharon, a retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and a sharp memory. She tilted her head and frowned. Standing behind her was Robert, a middle-aged mechanic with grease on his hands and a sense of right and wrong that didn't care about skin color. Both were watching, listening, uncomfortable. Before David could respond, Thomas gave a subtle nod, and James, the bank's security guard, stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." James said, his hand resting on the walkie-talkie at his hip. "Or I'll be forced to escort you out." David inhaled slowly. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply dialed and said, "Mary, it's time. I need you here now." Then he ended the call. The silence that followed was deafening. Sharon whispered to Robert, "This doesn't feel right." Robert muttered, "Nah, this is straight up wrong." Behind the teller counter, a younger employee, Angela, sat frozen. She had just started working at the bank 2 months ago. Fresh out of training, still learning the ropes. She had pulled up the executive accounts screen moments earlier and saw it David Coleman, CEO, VIP status, flagged for high-level access. But Thomas had glanced at her just once, and that look was enough to keep her silent. David returned his gaze to Thomas. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice steady as stone. "A serious one." Thomas shrugged. "We'll see about that." And that was when the atmosphere changed. David stepped slightly aside, looked through the glass doors, and waited. Customers began murmuring. The tension thickened. Angela's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her conscience flickering. Jessica scoffed, unaware her smirk was about to fade. And Thomas, standing tall in his illusion of control, didn't know that he had just stepped into the single most consequential moment of his professional life. The clock read 4:04 in the afternoon. 7 minutes remained before the end of the business day. 7 minutes before everything would flip upside down. 7 minutes before a man they had judged, mocked, and dismissed would reveal the truth and hold them all to account. Thomas scoffed, folding his arms like he'd won something. "CEO," he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're delusional." Jessica chuckled behind the counter, shaking her head as if the whole situation was entertainment. "Nice try," she said coldly, "but we're not falling for your act." The moment stretched long and tense. James, still stationed by David's side, stepped closer and placed a firm hand on his shoulder again, his tone more threatening this time. "You've been asked to leave," he said. "You can walk out or I'll walk you out." But David Coleman didn't move. His gaze was steady, unflinching. He looked James in the eye and said clearly, "Check the executive accounts. You'll see my name. Then ask yourself if this is really worth it." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with precision. A few customers behind him were now fully tuned in. Sharon, the retired schoolteacher, looked disgusted. "This isn't right," she muttered loud enough for the front desk to hear. "Check his ID properly. Treat him with respect." Robert, the blue-collar mechanic behind her, stepped closer too. "Man came in with his documents and an appointment," he said. "You're treating him like a thief just 'cause he's black. Shame on all of you." Their words didn't shift the staff's posture. If anything, they seemed to harden Thomas's pride. Sir Thomas said in a clipped tone, "This is a private institution. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. I don't have to explain myself to you or your fan club here." That was when something shifted behind the counter. Angela, the newer teller, hesitated. She had been silent this whole time, her hands hovering nervously above her keyboard. She looked down at the screen again. David Coleman. Executive-level client. High net worth flagged account. All the verification notes were there. She had no doubt it was real. But when she looked up, Thomas's glare caught her mid-thought. It was the kind of look that said, "Don't you dare." Angela swallowed hard and looked away. David caught that. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that glance was something heavier than accusation. It was disappointment. Not anger. Not blame. Just the quiet weight of having seen it all before. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't have to. Angela shifted in her seat, visibly uneasy, her conscience quietly waking. At that moment, David pulled out his phone again. This time, he didn't move to the side. He stayed right where he stood and spoke aloud as he dialed. "Mary," he said into the phone, his tone firmer than before, "bring the documents. All of them. And hurry." He ended the call without another word. Jessica rolled her eyes and whispered something to Thomas, who smirked. "Trying to stage a show now," he said mockingly. "What's next, camera crew?" David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The energy in the room was already shifting. Customers were whispering. Phones were coming out. Sharon folded her arms, standing her ground like a woman who'd seen too many injustices to ignore another. Robert stared directly at James and said, "You better hope that man's who he says he is. 'Cause if he is, you're about to lose that badge, brother." James flinched slightly, the first crack in his otherwise mechanical obedience. David stood still, perfectly still, like a mountain in a storm. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. But the longer he stood, the more Thomas's confidence began to crack. You could see it barely, but it was there. A twitch in the jaw, A glance toward the door, a hint of doubt. And then came the sound that broke the moment, the unmistakable click of high heels on tile, fast, purposeful drawing nearer. Everyone turned their heads at once. Through the glass doors of First National Bank, a woman in a dark suit was approaching, shoulders squared, stride, sharp a leather folder clutched tightly in her hand. It was Mary, David's assistant. And from the fire in her expression, she hadn't come to play nice. Thomas straightened up like he suddenly remembered he had a spine. Jessica tried to busy herself at the terminal, pretending not to notice the growing tension. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She knew who that was. Everyone did. Mary had a reputation for being ruthless in corporate circles, a former litigator who had left law to run operations for Coleman Holdings. If she was coming in person, something serious was about to happen. The seconds stretched. David turned slightly, just enough to greet Mary with a nod. She stepped beside him, cool and collected, and handed him the folder. Then she turned to face Thomas and asked one question. "Would you like to see your termination letter now or after the documents?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Robert let out a low whistle. Sharon's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas blinked like someone had thrown water in his face. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice suddenly unsure. But Mary wasn't done. She opened the folder and revealed 3 pages copies of board filings, corporate resolutions, and a notarized letter confirming David Coleman as CEO and controlling shareholder of Coleman Holdings, a key investor in First National Bank. Jessica paled. James stepped back. Angela sat completely still, as if frozen in place. Thomas, for the first time, looked visibly rattled. "These could be fake," he muttered, but even he didn't believe his own words. Mary stared at him and said coldly, "Or you could have verified them 3 calls ago. But you didn't. And now it's too late." David, still calm, said quietly, "Call Charles. He'll sort this out." That name hit like a silent bomb. Charles was the branch director, the highest authority in the building. And if David was invoking him directly, things were already far above Thomas's pay grade. Thomas reached for the phone with a trembling hand. The line rang. The entire lobby watched in silence, holding its breath. David turned to face the room, not to speak, but simply to stand there as a black man who had walked into a bank to withdraw his own money and been treated like a criminal. And now, with every tick of the clock, the tide was rising. The reckoning had only just begun. The lobby had gone still, not the silence of routine banking hours, but a thick waiting stillness, the kind that settles just before thunder breaks. Thomas, now visibly sweating, clutched the receiver with clammy fingers as he waited for Charles, the branch director, to pick up. But before a voice could answer on the other end, the glass doors opened again, and Mary, standing tall beside David, took a single step forward. Her heels clicked with precision, the leather folder still in hand, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "This is documentation from Coleman Holdings' legal office," she said, unfolding the contents without flinching. "It includes Mr. David Coleman's appointment as CEO, verified by the board of directors with full operating authority and financial rights. Your system should have confirmed all of this had you bothered to check it." She turned to Angela. "You saw it, didn't you?" Angela froze, caught like a deer in headlights. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Jessica glanced sideways, whispering under her breath, "Don't say anything, girl." David didn't press her. He simply nodded once at Mary, who continued laying out the stack of corporate papers and David's matching driver's license on the counter. "We have transaction records," she added. "Bank appointment logs, signed confirmations from your executive office. There was nothing unclear except your team's judgment." Thomas's voice cracked as he tried to regain control. This could be forged. We see this all the time. Sophisticated scams. Anyone can print a letterhead." "Do you hear yourself?" Sharon called out from the waiting line, shaking her head. "This man gave you ID. You refused to check it. Now he brings documents and suddenly it's a conspiracy." Robert, arms crossed, added, "Just say what you mean, man. You didn't believe him because of what he looks like. Period." Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, visibly flustered. James, the security guard, had slowly backed away from David now, uncertain whose orders to follow. Even Jessica stopped pretending to work. For the first time since the confrontation began, her smirk had vanished, replaced by a cold, unsettled stare. It was Angela who finally cracked. Her voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the tension. "He's telling the truth," she said. Then louder, more clearly, "David Coleman, executive client. His profile is right here on our internal system. VIP status, flagged for direct approval. I saw it 10 minutes ago." All eyes turned to her. Thomas's jaw tensed. Jessica muttered unbelievable under her breath. But it was too late. The truth had cracked open, and with it, the flimsy wall of authority Thomas had built was beginning to crumble. David didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or ask for apologies. He simply turned to Mary and said, "This isn't about me. It's about what this branch has become. Call Charles. He needs to see this with his own eyes." Mary nodded and dialed the direct line herself. After a brief exchange, she handed the phone to Thomas. "He wants to speak with you," she said coolly. Thomas took the handset, face flushed, and mumbled a few strained words before hanging up. He's on his way." Across the lobby, customers began to murmur. Some were quietly filming, others were simply watching in stunned silence. Sharon looked on with pride in her eyes while Robert whispered, "Finally." Jessica stepped back from her terminal. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced with something closer to dread. James, once stiff and obedient, now stood awkwardly by the wall, unsure of where he belonged in the power dynamic that had clearly shifted. And Angela, her shoulders finally relaxed, like she had stepped out from under a shadow, slowly moved toward the edge of the counter closer to David. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I wanted to say something sooner, but you saw how he looked at me." David gave her a long, measured look. He didn't scold. He didn't smile. He just said, "It's never easy to speak up, but it matters." Then he added, not unkindly, "Especially when you're the one holding the truth." At that moment, the lobby doors opened again. All heads turned as Charles entered, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with silver hair, a firm step, and a quiet kind of power. He was dressed in a dark, tailored suit and carried no briefcase, only purpose. He scanned the room quickly, taking in the cluster at the front desk, the tension in the air, the folder on the counter, and finally, David. "Mr. Coleman," Charles said with respect, stepping forward and extending his hand. "I came as quickly as I could. I heard there's been an issue." David shook his hand and gestured toward the documents. "You can see for yourself." Charles reviewed them carefully, one page at a time. He read the transaction logs, the executive confirmation letters, and the official credentials. As he read, Thomas fidgeted behind him, clearly sweating through his shirt. Jessica stared at the floor. Angela kept her eyes forward, steady now. After several long moments, Charles looked up. "These are legitimate," he said. "All of them. Mr. Coleman is exactly who he says he is." He turned to David again and bowed his head slightly. "Sir, on behalf of First National Bank, I offer my sincerest apology. This never should have happened." David didn't respond right away. His eyes swept the room past Thomas, past Jessica, past James, and finally settled on Charles. "It did happen," he said. "And that's the problem." Charles looked at him for a long, quiet second. Understood. Then David turned slowly toward the staff. "We're not done here," he said. His voice carried weight now, not just calm, but command. "We'll address this when the branch closes. I want everyone present." Thomas stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" David looked at him, unblinking. "It means you don't walk out of this unexamined. None of you do." Then, with a firm voice that silenced the entire room, he said, "No one leaves until I say so." Charles didn't argue. Mary didn't blink. And the room, once thick with doubt, now braced for what was coming. The clock on the wall read 4:39 in the afternoon, just 21 minutes until closing. But no one was going anywhere. Not yet. Because justice, real uncomfortable overdue justice, was finally walking through the front door. By the time the bank clock struck 5, the usual click of locking doors didn't mark the end of a quiet business day. It marked the beginning of a reckoning. The blinds had been drawn. The customers Sharon, Robert, and a few others had been invited to stay if they wished, and every one of them had chosen to remain. Not out of curiosity, but out of principle. They wanted to see what accountability looked like. Charles stood near the back office, arms folded, watching everything unfold with the solemn awareness that his branch was about to be rewritten in the public's memory. David Coleman stepped forward, not with anger, not with pride, but with the weight of a man who had carried injustice long enough to recognize its patterns before they even opened their mouths. He turned first to Thomas. "You were given every opportunity to treat me like a customer, like a human being. But instead you saw my skin and decided I didn't belong here." Thomas's mouth opened, but David raised a hand. "Don't speak. Just listen. You didn't ask for clarification. You didn't check the system. You assumed I was a fraud because I didn't match your image of wealth. And then when I provided documentation, you tried to cover your mistake with more arrogance. That's not leadership. That's cowardice hiding behind a title." Thomas's face flushed a deep red. He looked to Charles for backup, but Charles said nothing. David then turned to Jessica. "You laughed, mocked, said, 'You people.' That's not unconscious bias. That's overt disrespect. And it's dangerous, especially in institutions that handle people's futures. You don't get to smile while undermining someone's dignity." Jessica looked down her cheeks, pale lips pressed together as if trying to hold back excuses that no longer mattered. Then David looked at James. "You were told to remove me, and you followed those orders without asking a single question. You didn't verify. You didn't hesitate. You just acted like I was a problem to remove." James shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. David's reply was quiet, but firm. "That excuse has defended every injustice in history." The room remained still. Angela stood at her station, hands trembling slightly, her eyes filled with guilt. She didn't wait for David to turn. She spoke first. "I saw your account. I knew who you were. I should have said something, but I was afraid. I didn't want to lose my job." David nodded slowly. "Fear is real, but so is silence. And silence allows people like them to keep doing what they do. Next time, don't let fear make you complicit. Speak up sooner. Someone's dignity might depend on it." She nodded through tears, whispering, "I will. I promise." At the far side of the lobby, Daniel, the young intern who had stayed quiet through it all, clutched his notepad wide-eyed. He hadn't said a word, but you could tell he was watching everything, memorizing each detail, like a student studying a lesson no school ever taught. David noticed him and said gently, "Daniel, remember this moment. One day you'll have power in your own hands. Use it to protect people, not punish them." The words seemed to land like thunder inside the young man's chest. His head nodded quickly, almost instinctively. Charles stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman," he said, voice calm, but waited. "As director, I fully support any decisions you make. What happened here was unacceptable." David turned back to the 3 employees in question. "Then let's make it official." He looked each of them in the eye, not with vengeance, but with finality. "Thomas, Jessica, James, you are hereby terminated effective immediately. Your conduct today violated both policy and human decency. You are no longer representatives of this institution." The words hit like a gavel striking hardwood. Thomas's jaw clenched. "You can't just fire us," he snapped. "You're not even on the payroll." Charles raised a hand and replied evenly, "He's a majority shareholder, a CEO, and he has every legal authority to remove staff in breach of client protection standards. I'll have HR formalize it." Jessica stepped back, visibly shaken. James said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, his badge already unclipped. The lobby stayed silent as the three of them walked out one by one, heads lowered, the reality settling on their shoulders like a storm they never saw coming. Robert gave a single nod of approval. Sharon whispered, "That's what justice looks like." David remained still for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the silence say what words no longer needed to. Then he turned to face the rest of the room, the remaining staff, the witnesses, the leadership. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about the next man who walks in with dark skin and a bank card. It's about the woman who gets doubted before she opens her mouth. It's about every silent moment that allows discrimination to breathe." His voice didn't rise, but it carried. "Today I had power, but most don't. So the question isn't how you treat someone when they have influence, it's how you treat someone when you think they have none." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling across every face in the room. Angela wiped her eyes. Daniel straightened his shoulders. Charles bowed his head slightly. And Mary, still standing off to the side, gave the smallest nod, one of pride, not position. David glanced at the clock. "Now," he said, "before I leave, I want to speak to all of you, staff leadership and those who stayed. You should hear this." He paused and added, "Because the next part isn't about accountability. It's about change." And just like that, the temperature in the room shifted again, not with tension, but with anticipation. The firings were done, but the conversation was just beginning. Because what David had to say next wasn't just for them, it was for all of us. As the dust of the confrontation settled and the doors of the bank remained locked behind the dismissed employees, David Coleman stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by stunned silence and watchful eyes. The hum of air conditioning, the soft rustle of paper, the occasional shuffle of nervous feet, those were the only sounds that filled the room, but no one dared speak. Charles, standing beside Mary, looked on with quiet approval, while Angela hovered near her terminal, her posture a blend of shame and hope. Jessica's seat sat empty now, and James's absence at the door was a reminder that what had just taken place was not performance. It was a turning point. Thomas had left with a scowl that quickly wilted under the glares of customers still watching. Now David faced the remaining staff and the loyal few who had stayed to witness it all. His tone was calm, but every syllable carried weight. "Some of you," he began, "chose silence today. Some chose to watch. Others chose to speak." His eyes briefly met Angela's. "There's no shame in fear," he said. "Only in letting fear become your compass." Angela swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman, I need to say something." David nodded. "Go ahead." Her voice was shaky at first, but grew steadier as she spoke. "I saw your account early. I saw your name. I knew it was real. But I looked at Thomas and I froze. I didn't want to lose my job. But that's no excuse. I was wrong to stay quiet. You didn't deserve what happened." David studied her. He didn't respond with praise or forgiveness. Instead, he offered truth. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers late but still shows up. You spoke now. That matters. Just don't wait next time. Angela's shoulders dropped slightly, as if an invisible weight had shifted. "I won't," she said quietly. Then came a voice from the back, young, hesitant, but filled with sincerity. It was Daniel, the intern. Mr. Coleman. David turned. Daniel took a step forward, clutching his notebook to his chest. "I didn't know what to do either. I've only been here a few weeks. But watching all this, watching you, it changed something in me. I want to be someone who speaks up too. I want to be someone who leads like you do." The words came from a place untouched by ego. They were raw, simple, and powerful. David offered a rare smile, not wide, but real. "Then remember this day," he said. "Not because of what happened to me, but because of what it revealed. Remember how easy it is for a system to break down when good people stay quiet. Daniel nodded, his face flushing with determination. Mary stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on David's arm. "You should finish this," she said. "They're ready." David turned to the group, including Charles, Sharon, Robert, Angela, Daniel, and the remaining tellers and clerks. "This branch doesn't need a new paint job or a new sign. It needs a new culture. Respect should never depend on perception. Integrity should never bow to bias." He looked to Charles. "Do you support change here?" Charles nodded without hesitation. "I do." "Then start today," David said. "Retrain every employee. Implement oversight. Hold staff accountable not just to numbers but to values. Every teller, every guard, every manager." Charles replied, "We will. Starting with internal audits and a new code of conduct." David added, "And make it public. Let your customers know this bank chooses justice over convenience. Let them know silence won't be policy anymore." At that moment, Sharon, the retired school teacher, stepped forward. "May I?" she asked. David nodded. Sharon addressed the staff gently but firmly. "I taught for 42 years in Atlanta public schools. I've seen how young minds mirror what adults allow. What happened here today is what happens when bias goes unchecked and what redemption looks like when someone refuses to walk away. Don't forget what you saw here. Because people like me, we've lived it for decades, and people like David Coleman, they've carried it with grace, but that doesn't mean it's light." Robert, standing beside her, added, "That's right, and I'm just a mechanic. Grease under my nails and all. But I've been turned away from counters like this too. You never forget being looked at like a threat instead of a man. What happened today, this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity." Their words lingered in the air like incense, unshakable, honest, deeply American, in the most painful and hopeful ways. David stood a little taller, as if the voices around him added to his presence. He looked back at the staff and said, "I didn't come here today expecting any of this. I came to withdraw funds for a deal, but what I saw instead was a moment to draw a line in the sand, not with anger, but with truth. That's what leadership is." Mary checked her watch, then whispered, "The press will ask questions when this hits the wire." David nodded. "Let them. The truth will speak for itself." He walked slowly toward the exit, then stopped halfway and turned back. To everyone who stayed, he said, "Thank you. This isn't just the end of a mistake, it's the beginning of something better. But only if you keep choosing courage." Charles extended a hand. David shook it. "You've got 6 months," David said. "I'll be back. And I'll expect to see a different branch than the one I walked into today." Charles nodded again. "You have my word." The door buzzed and opened. David stepped outside, the sun now low in the sky, casting long shadows behind him. But inside the bank, the light had only just begun to change. The air inside First National Bank felt different now, not just because the loudest voices had exited, but because something quieter and stronger had taken root. After David Coleman's final words and steady departure, a hush lingered over the lobby, not of confusion or fear, but of reflection. People weren't just stunned, they were changed. Charles stood at the center with a posture that seemed to carry both humility and responsibility. He cleared his throat gently and said, "Everyone, please stay. Before we close the night, I want us to take a moment together." Around him, staff members slowly gathered. Angela stepped forward without needing to be called. Daniel came with his notebook still clutched in one hand, the pen tucked behind his ear like a student hungry to learn. Sharon and Robert remained as well, choosing not to leave just yet, as if their presence gave this moment a kind of moral weight. Then, almost unexpectedly, Mary returned to the middle of the room. She wasn't just David's assistant, she had been his witness, his second voice, and the person who knew exactly how much he'd held and how often he'd swallowed indignity for the sake of peace. Her voice, when it came, was low and even. "You may not realize it now, but you just witnessed something rare. Not because it was dramatic or public or uncomfortable, but because someone with power chose not to use it for revenge." Her eyes scanned the room. Mr. Coleman didn't embarrass you. He didn't shout. He could have, but he didn't. He showed you that strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just tells the truth and waits for the echo. Angela wiped at her eyes again, no longer hiding her emotion. It echoed, she said softly, loud and clear. Daniel nodded. For me too. Charles turned to his staff, his voice firmer now. Then let's not waste this moment. I've been in this job a long time. I've seen complaints come and go. But today was different. Today we were held accountable in real time. That's not something we can forget or recover from by simply saying, sorry. We have to change. A silence passed not from reluctance, but from agreement. No one disagreed with what Charles said, and that's when Sharon, steady and dignified, took one final step forward. Then let me offer this, she said. As a retired educator, I know systems don't change with rules. They change with culture. If you want this branch to heal, then it can't just be about checking diversity boxes or posting new slogans. It's about how you look at people, how you pause before judging, how you speak especially when you think no one's watching. Robert added, and how you back someone up when they're telling the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Mary gave them both a look of gratitude. That's what David was hoping for. Not to fire people, not to shame them, but to plant a seed. It's up to you now to water it. Angela turned toward Charles. What happens next? She asked, not defensively but openly, like someone truly ready to be better. Charles answered without hesitation. Mandatory training, independent reviews of customer service, anonymous feedback lines, and monthly internal sessions on equity and human dignity, not from some corporate script, from real stories, from people who've been through it. Daniel spoke next, his voice still finding its place. Can I help? I know I'm just an intern, but I want to be part of that change. Charles smiled. That's exactly the spirit we need. You're not just anything, Daniel. You're someone who saw the problem and chose to stay. That counts for more than you know. Angela then surprised them all by walking to the counter and pulling out a small folded piece of paper from her drawer. She unfolded it and held it up. This is a copy of Mr. Coleman's account profile, the one I didn't speak up about earlier. Her voice cracked but held steady. I'm keeping it in my drawer not to shame myself but to remind myself that I saw it, that I knew better, that next time I won't wait. A hush fell again, this time heavy with respect. No one asked her to put it away. No one questioned her intention. Even Mary gave the smallest nod. That's courage, she said quietly. Owning what you could have done differently. The group stood in thoughtful stillness, and then Charles raised his voice just enough to speak to the entire room. Let tonight be the start. Not the fix, but the foundation. We will become a place where justice doesn't arrive at closing time, but is present every time the doors open. Murmurs of agreement followed, small but sincere. And then Daniel, with all his youthful honesty, looked up and said, Mr. Coleman said he'd be back in 6 months. Charles nodded. And we'll be ready for him. Sharon smiled. And if you're not trust me, I'll be right behind him. Laughter broke the tension at last, soft and human. Robert clapped Daniel gently on the back. Angela exhaled deeply, her first real breath of peace in hours. Mary looked out the window where night had fully settled in, then turned back to the room and said, Thank you, all of you, for staying, for listening, and for choosing to grow instead of retreat. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused by Angela and whispered, He'll remember you. Angela looked at her, surprised. Why, Mary answered without hesitation. Because you changed. The clock ticked softly overhead, and the fluorescent lights hummed. But the room, once divided by judgment and fear, now felt like something closer to unity. Not perfection, not yet, but a start. And in stories like this, a start is everything. 6 months passed, and the skyline of downtown Atlanta remained the same shimmering towers, restless traffic sunlight bouncing off the windows of buildings that held 1,000 daily dramas within. But inside First National Bank, something had shifted permanently. It wasn't visible on a spreadsheet or measured in foot traffic, but the change was real, and it pulsed through every interaction, every transaction, every welcome at the door. The branch that had once humiliated David Coleman had quietly become a symbol of something far greater than redemption. It had become a model of intentional culture change. The doors now opened each morning with purpose. Angela, once the hesitant teller frozen by fear, now stood with quiet confidence behind the counter, not because the job changed, but because she had. She greeted each customer with clear eyes and steady words, never forgetting the weight of her silence that day, nor the strength it took to speak afterward. She had completed a diversity and ethics course at her own expense, then requested to mentor new hires on empathy, accountability, and integrity. And when asked why, she'd say softly, "Because I didn't act when I should have. I won't make that mistake again." Daniel, the young intern with fire in his eyes and a notebook in his hand, had finished his internship, but Charles brought him back as a part-time employee, then promoted him to training assistant. It was Daniel who now led orientation sessions for new staff, opening each one with a quote from David's speech. "The real test of character is how you treat someone when you think they have no power." He didn't recite it like a slogan. He carried it like a compass, and the staff listened. Because Daniel had been there when the branch learned the hard way what that lesson meant. Charles, the branch director, had made good on every commitment. The monthly training sessions weren't just checkboxes. They became real conversations with staff, sharing lived experiences, some painful, some hopeful. Anonymous surveys were implemented, internal audits became routine, and an equity liaison was appointed. Charles didn't pretend to be perfect, but he led by showing that transparency was strength, not risk. Every Friday, he placed a handwritten quote near the entrance. One morning it read, "Justice delayed is dignity denied." That quote, too, came from David Coleman. And speaking of David, he returned. Right on time. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when he walked through those same glass doors. No announcement, no press. Just a calm presence and the quiet click of polished shoes on tile. He wasn't wearing a suit that day, just a crisp shirt slacks, and the same unshakable dignity that once silenced a lobby full of doubters. The moment Angela saw him, she stood upright and smiled this time with no hesitation, and said, "Welcome back, Mr. Coleman. We've been expecting you." Charles came from the back and extended a hand, not just in formality, but with the genuine warmth of someone who had faced the fire and chosen to grow. "We kept our word," he said. David looked around slowly at the updated signage on the wall about customer dignity, the new transparency policy printed at every desk, the diverse staff now working in harmony, and simply nodded. "I can see that." He spent nearly an hour visiting with staff, asking questions not just about processes, but about how they felt doing their jobs. At one point, he pulled Daniel aside and asked how things were going. Daniel grinned and said, "I don't just have a job, now I have a mission." David chuckled softly and said, "Good. Then I did my part." The visit ended in the small staff break room where Charles had gathered everyone for a short acknowledgement. "We're not perfect," he said plainly, "but we're better. And that's because we stopped hiding from what we saw and started changing how we lead." David looked around the room, eyes landing on Angela, then Daniel, then Sharon and Robert, who'd shown up just to see him again, and said, "You all proved something rare, that transformation isn't a speech or a headline. It's 1,000 small decisions made when no one's watching. You could have buried that day. Instead, you built something from it. That matters." And with that, he turned to leave. But just before he reached the door, he paused, turned back and added quietly, "I didn't come back for applause. I came back to make sure that moment wasn't wasted. You've honored it. Now keep going." And then he was gone like a ripple that had passed through still water, leaving it forever changed. Outside, the sun lit the sidewalk the same way it had 6 months earlier, but inside First National something had shifted permanently. Not because a CEO demanded respect, but because a community chose to reclaim its soul. That story spread not through viral videos or breaking news, but through whispers, testimonies, and quiet conversations in churches, barbershops, classrooms, and waiting lines. Sharon and Robert told it often. That man, Sharon would say, walked in for a withdrawal and gave us all a deposit of courage. Robert would add, he didn't just change the bank, he changed the temperature of the whole city. And in homes across Atlanta and far beyond, his story lived on not as a warning, but as a reminder. That dignity is not something to be granted. It's something that must be recognized. That power, when used with grace, can do more than punish, it can elevate. And that justice doesn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes it walks quietly through the doors of a bank, refuses to bow, and plants the kind of seed that blooms long after the moment is gone. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and always stand for what's right.